this is a part of a series with Biddeford Community Gardens and Holly Culleton. I'm going to ask Holly to just unmute and introduce herself for a moment.
Hello, Ray. I'm happy to be here tonight.
So we're really excited. We've been doing this since before pandemic, and then we sort of did a little bit during pandemic where we were doing some virtual programming, but we've got a great lineup this year. We have talks coming up about beekeeping, maple syrup. We're doing a film viewing of the film Growing Cities, which we're very excited about. The programs are going to be the fourth Tuesday of every month until October, ending with like a big pumpkin festival for us, like online pump, but hopefully maybe we'll be in person by then. And there's also going to be a very special festival that we're hoping to be working on with Biddeford Community Gardens sometime in May. Is it May, Holly?
Saturday, May 21st from 12 to 4. We're actually calling it the Spring Pollinator Festival, and we're having lots of different organizations and the city and Heart of Biddeford, Engine, the library involved with this, and just received word today from the ecology school. They'll be joining us as well. So
perfect. That's exciting. Yeah. So keep that date open for the Pollinator Festival at Rotary Park, right?
Yes.
Okay. So it is my distinct pleasure to introduce Ray Marcotte, and I know Ellen Canner is in the background there as well. If you haven't had an opportunity to visit their website or their tea shop, you really should, because it's kind of amazing. My favorite part is just looking at all the different places that you visited and all the very cool pictures. But we're going to learn a little bit more about tea. So I hope you'll share with us too how Dobra got started here in Portland, because that's kind of a fascinating story about your return to Maine and opening one of the Dobra tea shops here in the United States, which was the second in the country?
The third.
So yeah. It's really fascinating, but your knowledge of tea is unbelievable. And Ray used to work here at the library, so I'm really glad to see him again and have an opportunity to visit. So without further ado, thanks for visiting us, Ray and Ellen.
Thanks, Melanie. Ellen just mentioned to me that you can pin on the TCAM if you like. Else, should you give them more information about that? Oh, there it is. Can you guys see the TCAM? Okay.
Yeah, you can just pin it temporarily or call it up and then go back to the presentation.
So, hello, my name is Ray Marcotte, and I'm here with Ellie Canner. We are joint owners of Dobra Tea here in Portland, Maine. It's in the Old Port. We opened, what was it, April 1st, 2011. So we've been open almost 11 years. Things have been a little rocky in the last few years because of the pandemic, but we're still here. Do you want to say anything else about yourself? I mean, because I'm gonna do a bunch of slides as well to give you some history and such. But you're good. Okay. Let me call up that screen share, because it starts out with the introduction. Okay. Does everybody see that? Okay. So here's our address, 89 Exchange Street in the Old Port. Our website is www.dobratme.com. Sorry, Els.
There's a thing in the way. color palette.
Okay. And again, there's an external shot of the tea room. So we're located on Upper Exchange Street. If you know where, well, you can see in the sign it says Sonny's, but that is now Black Cow. So we're right across the street from the Indian restaurant. And there's an interior shot of the tea space. So you can see the chairs are sort of have this Asian feel, wicker chairs. It feels like a Dobra tea, we try to create this environment where you're walking into an Asian tea room, but it could be Japanese, it could be Chinese, it could be Taiwanese. You're not really sure. So it's elements of all of those countries. The reason I'm showing you this slide is because here in the United States, when we think of tea, we really think of English tea. And tea didn't originate in England. It didn't come from England. They actually stole tea from China. And there's a great book, if you ever want to read about it. It's called For All the Tea in China by Sarah Rose. Highly recommend this if you're interested in like historical reads. For All the Tea in China by Sarah Rose. Really interesting. There's several copies in the library system. So anyway, so when we think of tea in the US, we think of English tea. And so Anna Russell, who is the Duchess of Bedford, she actually started tea in England in 1840. There was a saying that she needed to cure this sinking feeling she had in the late afternoon. So in the picture here, this is just a visual of what an English tea would look like on a summer afternoon. And notice they're in low chairs, they're not in high chairs. And the reason I say that is because when we say high tea, what we really mean, we probably actually mean afternoon tea or low tea. It's not usually called low tea, but it really is. Tea and accompanying food that was consumed in low chairs in the afternoon. For the English, it was a light meal, again, to cure that sinking feeling they had, because the upper classes were, tended to eat dinner really late into the evening, like at 8 or 9 p.m. So high tea, which is what we usually say, really doesn't mean a highfalutin tea. It means tea sitting on higher chairs, like at a dinner table. So more for the working classes, they would come home and eat their meal and have tea at 6 or 6:30 at night. And it's also known as meat tea. Tea with milk was necessary as a nutrient for supplementing a working meal. So that's kind of an interesting thing to note, that we often say high tea, but we really probably mean afternoon tea. A little bit about the history of tea in terms of tea bags. This is another thing. In the US, when we think of tea, we think of English tea, and then we think of tea bags. Well, I want to point out that tea bags are actually the byproduct of whole leaf production. And it was actually an accident that tea bags were discovered. It was a guy by the name of Thomas Sullivan, who was a New York tea importer. He was sending some samples to some of his customers, and the customers got the tea in the mail, and they took the tea and they put it right into their cup with the boiling water in the package. So it was an accident that tea bags came about. Once he found out that they were doing that, he got an idea. It's like, oh, how can I make tea more convenient, really? Because loose leaf tea, while it's delicious and better than bag tea, it's not fast and it's not convenient, but it is much better. Just a shot of Eastern tea brewing versus Western tea brewing. Here in the West, we think of tea, we think of English tea with delicate bone china, fancy teapots, much larger teapots as well. And the screenshot on the left shows an Asian brewing apparatus where the teapot is really small, very simple, and drunk out of these very small cups. And it's the tea leaves are also brewed multiple times. And you notice on the right, there's milk in the tea. Tea is almost never drunk with milk in it in Asia, almost never. So where did tea come from? It didn't come from England. It actually originated in China about 4,700 years ago. So almost 5,000 years ago. The most common legend is that Emperor Shennong was sitting under a tea bush while he was boiling water, because back then they used to boil the water. They knew that they needed to boil the water to purify it before they could drink it. And he was sitting under a tea bush in his garden. And the story goes that a tea leaf floated down into his cup and it infused with the water, and tea was born. So it was sort of an accidental discovery. Now that's the legend. Whether it's true, that's the one that's sort of most accepted. And we're not even sure if Emperor Shennong was a real person, but they do say that he was the father of Chinese agriculture. So tea's been around for a long time. 5,000 years. When we think of tea, we think of small leaf variety, there's two basic types of tea. And here in the US, whenever we say tea, we might be referring to herbal tea, like chamomile, for instance, we call tea, but it's not from the tea plant. That is, it's not from Camellia sinensis. So Camellia sinensis is Latin. In sinensis itself, that word means China. So the small leaf variety of the tea plant originated in China, again, about 2700 BCE, so almost 5,000 years ago. And the large leaf variety originated in India. And it was discovered by an explorer by the name of Major Robert Bruce. So here in the Dobra tea room, we have teas from China, Taiwan, Japan, Korea, Vietnam, India, Sri Lanka, Africa, all over Asia. And we also source some teas from the US, but most high quality tea, that is Camellia sinensis, is not grown in the US. There are a few exceptions, and Hawaii being one of the best for green tea. Here's a map showing where the two varieties originated. So sinensis, the small leaf variety, originated in southern China in the Yunnan province. And the large leaf variety originated in Assam, India. So can you see my little cursor here? This is actually part of India. India has this finger that sticks out to the right. That's the Assam region. So it's very close to Tibet, and it's very close to China, actually. So tea originated in those two areas, and then it was brought to other areas, like it was brought to Japan by Buddhist monks. It was brought to Korea. It didn't originate there. Just a photo of one of our photos in a tea field in China. This is Camellia sinensis, genus, species, variety. So the China bush, again, is the small leaf variety, much smaller than the Assam tea bush. Here's the Assamica variety. You'll notice that the land behind us is really flat. The Assam region is not mountainous like parts of China where most tea is grown in China. At very mountainous areas, that is the best tea. But you can't really see it, but the leaves are much larger for Camellia sinensis Assamica. They might be 6 or 7 inches long, whereas the sinensis variety are much smaller, maybe is no more bigger than like 2 inches. And this is a photo of us. Ellen and I are directly in the middle. Ellen's wearing the sunglasses, and I'm standing behind her. And then to the left and right of us are other tea room owners, because at Dobra, there's 5 or 6 tea rooms in the US. But when we go on our tea trips, we join the Czech tea room owners. So I didn't actually mention in the beginning that we do go on tea trips every spring. And this particular one, I'm not sure, it was 2016 maybe. I can't remember. They all kind of meld together. But this one we went to Darjeeling in India, in Nepal. So when we talk about tea, there's actually 6 classes of tea, and the last one that we call tea, again, are herbals, but the correct name is tisanes. And those are basically things like peppermint and chamomile that we drink. They're concoctions, but they're not from Camellia sinensis. So we're going to talk a bit about how tea is produced: green tea, yellow tea, white tea, oolong tea, black tea, and pu'er tea. And I'm going to show you a few slides. When you think about tea, one thing that you should really focus on is that word oxidation. Enzymes in the tea leaves react with air to create a red-brown color and characteristic aroma to the tea leaves. And I always say you can think of a cut apple. In our everyday experience, we see that happening. So you take something organic like a banana or an apple, once you cut it and you expose it to air, it's going to start turning brown. So it's the same thing that happens to a tea leaf. So if the producer is making green tea, they want to take those leaves and heat the leaves right away. And that heating kills the enzymes in the leaf and keeps the leaves green. So a lot of people don't know this, but green tea, black tea, oolong tea, they all come from the same plant. It's just the way the tea leaf is processed that changes it into a different class. So the first class we're going to talk about is green tea. And green tea in China is usually pan-fired. So again, the heating of the tea leaves kills the enzymes and stops the oxidation. So 1, 2, even 3 years later, those tea leaves are still going to be green. They're going to stay in that fixed state. This is a photo of the first step of green tea production, people standing out in a field plucking the tea leaves. So people don't realize how involved or how much goes into producing tea. So this is a photo that's taken in southern China. The participants, oh, sorry, the pluckers are standing in the tea field, and they're plucking a certain pluck of the bush, and they're throwing it over their shoulder into the basket. And they're looking for what we call 2 leaves in a bud. So there's a close-up of the tea plant. The tip is that little unopened leaf. The first leaf is the one off to the left, and the second leaf is the one off to the right. So that is like a classic pluck. Some green teas are just the bud, especially some white teas. So they're out in that tea field picking just that one little leaf. It's very, very labor intensive. And you can imagine, because they're only looking for that first bud leaf, the teas are very expensive. And they only flush in the early spring. So they have to get them at just the right time of year. But most tea plucks are the bud, the first leaf, and the second leaf. And then after they pluck them, they're going to bring them into the factory. They're going to let them wither a little bit. And withering just means that the leaves start to get all pliable and wilty. Because if you pluck the leaves and you immediately start working with them, they're going to be brittle, and the leaf is just going to crack and fall apart. So they want them to gain some moisture. And remember, if it's green tea, they want to heat the leaves very quickly right in the beginning. And this is a photo of tea walks. So again, pan fired. The woman in the back of that wall is tending the fire. And they're actually producing a Chinese green tea called Luan Guapian that goes through 3 wok stages. It goes from the right to the left. And the temperatures are different in each of those woks. So it's a real art to make these teas. They let us actually give it a go, and we were like burning the leaves. It was really, we tasted the tea that we finished, and they're not very good. So it's a real art to make good tea. That's why loose leaf, whole leaf tea is so expensive, much more expensive than coffee. Much more goes into it. And then after they've heated the leaves, they've fixed them so they're going to stay green. They need to put them through a sifter so they get out any debris, stems, and such. And then they're going to, well, you see that guy in the background in this slide? He's sitting in the chair. He's the guy that actually comes along afterwards and sweeps up all what we call the dust or the fannings. And those are what end up in tea bags. That's why tea bag tea is so inexpensive, because it's the byproduct of whole leaf tea. So we've talked about Chinese green tea, staying with green tea, but moving on to Japan. Tea in China is mostly done by hand, almost exclusively, hand-picked, hand-rolled, etc. Japan is very, very mechanized. And I've asked why that is, and some of it is that they just have a lot less labor force, and they also tend to be very inventive. You can think of Toyota cars or Honda cars, well-oiled machines. Well, they use a lot of machinery in tea production as well. And the Japanese don't care so much about what the leaf looks like. They want a consistency and flavor. So Japanese tea leaves are much more fine and cut up. Can you see those on the tea cam? So she's showing you a Japanese green tea called gyokuro, which is much finer than Chinese tea. It's almost like needle-like. And that's because it was processed or shaved with a machine. And you notice on the slide, Japanese tea has only been around about 1,300 years because it was brought from China to Japan in the 700s to help monks keep alert during their long meditations. So it wasn't native to Japan, it was brought there. Japanese tea field looks very different than a Chinese tea field. Looks very manicured. Notice there's fans in the background. These fans are for controlling temperature, for frost, so that they can prolong the growing season. Again, very mechanized. There's a machine that runs through the field and chops off the first 2 or 3 inches off of the tea bushes. It just sort of runs through the rows of the fields. You know, so you can imagine having to pluck all those fields versus running through it with basically a big lawnmower. It's much faster. And then he dumps his load into the truck and it goes off to the factory. And there are smaller machines used as well, rather than that big tractor. But again, they're still machines. And there are exceptions in Japan. And the one type of tea, or there's actually two, but one of the types of tea that they pick by hand is called matcha. And matcha has sort of exploded in our culture now. It's a shade-grown tea. And the reason they do that is because they figured out that if they put these tarps over the fields for the last, it's about 3 weeks of the growing season, it stresses the tea plants and it forces them to push more chlorophyll into the leaf. So they get really delicate and bright green. And then because it's such a high-end expensive tea, they have people hand pluck these leaves underneath the tarp. So you can see these two folks are standing underneath a dark tarp that's blocking out like 85 or 90% of the sunlight. It's a very interesting thing that they came up with, that blocking the sunlight, stressing the plants so that the plants actually produce more chlorophyll, and it pushes more theanine into the leaves. We'll talk about theanine later, but theanine is what gives you that calmness when you drink tea. Coffee doesn't have that element in it. What's that, El? Ellen is showing you some matcha in the tea cam. So if none of you, or I'm guessing some of you have at least had matcha. It's this bright powdery green tea. And how does it get powdery? It gets powdery from the stone mill. It's a granite stone mill that they use. The plucked tea leaves that are ground up are called tencha, and then the tencha becomes matcha. Matcha just means, cha means tea. It's taken from China. And matcha means powdered tea. So it is a really delicious tea. I've been drinking matcha every morning for years. It's really good for you because you're not only steeping the tea, but you're drinking the whole leaf because it's ground into a powder. So it's got lots of antioxidants in it and lots of theanine. Second class of tea we'll talk about is yellow tea. And what sets yellow tea apart from green tea essentially is it's almost the same production process. It's probably the least known class of tea. A lot of tea shops don't carry it because there's not much of it anymore. It's very labor intensive to produce, so there aren't a lot of people producing it. Can you show them yellow tea? Okay, so that's yellow tea in the tea cam. And again, really the only difference between green tea and yellow tea is that there's an added production step that they call smothering. And what that does is they take the early buds and they wrap them in this cloth. And the tea producers say that the tea breathes in its own aromatics because it's closed off, and it makes the green tea leaves, or it makes the final product taste less grassy. Some people complain that green tea is too astringent for their stomach, but yellow tea calms that down a bit. It's a little less grassy. Here's a photo of them where they wrap it in this cloth, and they repeat this wrapping, smothering process for 2 or 3 days. It's very, very labor intensive, all done by hand as well. So yellow tea is very expensive. Next class of tea is white tea. And white tea is the simplest class of tea that's produced. It's a complex tea, but it's got the least amount of steps. All they do is basically pluck the tea leaves, they let it wither mostly in the sun, and then they dry it. And it's lightly oxidized. You can really see oxidation in the lower left in Baimudan, it's called, which is a white tea. Is that? So Ellen's showing a white tea in the tea cam. That in the lower, in the big slide, the lower left where it says white tea, that is called Baimudan, and you can really see oxidation. You can see where the leaves are both green and brown, so they are lightly oxidized. They're going from green tea towards black tea, which is the other end of the spectrum. So they're just at the beginning of oxidation, but that heating is what stops the oxidation and keeps them in that state. Like I said, most white tea is mostly just withered in the sun. So this is a photo of a field of solar withering, where they just put out all the tea leaves and let them wither in the sun, and then they fully dry them. So it's very simple. A lot of white tea looks like it just fell off the tea bush because they don't roll it, they don't do a lot to it. And you can see silver needles in the tea cam. So silver needles is a bud only leaf. Remember I talked about the tip, the first leaf and the second leaf? Well, Yingen or silver needles is a very expensive white tea because again, they're plucking just that one leaf. Very labor intensive. And that's a close-up of Baimudan. They do a final air drying just to keep it in that 20% oxidized state. They don't want it to turn black. They want to keep it in that semi-oxidized state. And speaking of semi-oxidation, we call oolong tea, the next class of tea, specifically semi-oxidized because it truly is between a green tea and a black tea. And there's both green oolongs, which are lightly oxidized, and dark oolongs, which are more heavily oxidized. So the oxidation in oolongs goes anywhere from, say, 15% all the way up to 80 or 85%. In oolong teas, unlike white teas, it's probably the most labor-intensive, difficult class of tea to make. And they're also some of the most interesting tasting teas. Really, really delicious. Got all kinds of different flavor profiles going on in oolong teas. So there's a lot of withering, there's a lot of rolling, repeated tumbling. Some of them are strip style, some of them are rolled. Strip style means that they're long and wiry. You can see that in the tea cam, long and wiry leaves, versus rolled ones, which are much tighter and they're rolled up into these little balls. And I'll show you how they do that. Here's a screenshot of a Taiwan oolong tea garden. It's a high mountain tea garden or Gaoshan. So these tea pluckers are at like 6,000 to 7,000 feet. It's really high up. And some of these gardens get as high as 10 or even 12,000 feet. So Taiwan was one of the highlights of our tea trips. It's such a beautiful place. I can see why China really wants to get their thumb on Taiwan. It's a beautiful country. You can see it's been in the news a lot lately, but it's been like that for years. You can see they're wearing hats, they're wearing scarves. The tea bushes are very abrasive. So they're covering themselves up from the elements. It's intense sunlight at that elevation as well. I mentioned that one of the most common steps in oolong production is that repeated tumbling and rolling. So this is a tumbling machine where they put the leaves in and it goes through these multiple stages of tumbling and rolling. And he wraps it in that cloth afterwards, oolong wrapping in a cloth for compression. So if the tea is going to be those little tea balls that Ellen just showed you, those teas, the rolled oolongs would go through this compression stage. That machine presses down and it rolls like this at the same time. So it's both pressing down and rolling around. So it forms those little tea balls and it makes the tea really complex in its flavor profiles. Here's a great shot that Ellen took at Sun Moon Lake in Taiwan. So we're up on this really cool tower looking down on Sun Moon Lake. This country is just so beautiful. It's one of the most beautiful trips that we went on in the last 10 years. Here's me and Ellen in a tea factory in Taiwan, and we're doing oolong tea tumbling. So this is like 12:30 in the morning. We were there, we went, it's almost 1 o'clock in the morning and these guys are still in the tea factory and they were there all night. They do this in shifts during the season because they can't, oolong tea production is complex that they can't leave the tea in a certain state. They have to go to the next step or else it'll continue to oxidize, and they want to keep it in a certain state so that they have a final product that they're seeking. So we had a lot of fun going there in the middle of the night, basically, and helping them out and getting to see oolong tea production firsthand. There's a fog-shrouded mountain in Taiwan. Beautiful area. Alishan Tea Garden, again in Taiwan. This is at like 11,000 feet. Mount Washington in New Hampshire is 6288, so we're at double that, and it was incredible, beautiful area. Some of you may have seen the movie Spirited Away, or at least heard of it. It was actually filmed here on the coast of Taiwan at near the Geofen Tea House. So really beautiful tea house. And this is a photo of the interior of the tea house where we're brewing tea, and we're doing it Eastern style with a little mini gaiwan, which means lidded bowl. So again, Eastern brewing versus Western brewing, multiple steepings using a small vessel, having a lot more control over your brewing. Black tea production is on the other end of the oxidation scale. So we started with green tea, which is fully unoxidized, meaning it stays green because they heat the leaves. We'll notice in the production steps of black tea, there's no heating involved. It's plucking, withering, rolling, oxidizing, and drying. There's no heating because if they heated the leaf, it would stay green. They want it to oxidize. They want it to turn black. And there's Ellen. She looks like she's literally withering. She's very warm. This is a photo taken in India. And we're in a tea factory, and we're on the second floor of the tea factory. So it makes it even hotter because you're up high and, heat rises. And this is a tea trough where the tea is in its withering phase. It was plucked. It's in its withering phase. And from there, it's going to be rolled. So where Ellen is standing, at her feet, there's a chute in the floor. So you open up that chute right there, and the tea comes down that chute and into this rolling machine. And that woman who's standing on the machine, she's about 4'2". She's tiny. So she's perfect. Little hands, she can sort of move the tea around. And notice that it says Britannia on the front of the tea roller. And that sign you see is not a swastika on the left. It's actually the symbol for Buddhism. So it's the swastika sort of inverted. But the machine is made in England. So there's that connection between colonialism with India. The tea boss is in the background supervising. And then once it's rolled, they need to lay it out so it can oxidize. They want it to absorb air. All it is like if you take that cut apple, you cut it and you don't heat it, it's going to turn black. Well, that's the same thing that's happening with the tea leaves. And it's taking on that nice aroma, that brisk flavor that we're all familiar with black tea. Very different from green tea. It's the other end of the spectrum. I showed you this photo because there's basically two types of black tea production. There's orthodox, which is the tea leaves that we all are familiar with. And then there's what most of the world producers make with black tea, and that's called CTC. It means crushed, torn, and curled. It's these little pellets that they use, and you can see it in the tea can. Little tiny tea pellets, all done by machine, mass produced. We use that to make chai because it's really dark, rich black tea that brews up really quickly, and it lends itself really well to mixing with milk and sweetener. So it makes a really delicious chai. And this fella is called the chai walla. Walla just means vendor. So he's a chai walla, and they're on every corner in India. And you can get these endless cups of chai for like next to nothing. There's us, me, and the guy on my left is the tea room owner in Dobra tea room owner in Ashland, Oregon. That's the only tea room in the US that's on the West Coast. You notice the calendar in the back, it's 2017. And this is a photo taken in Darjeeling. So Darjeeling, you've all probably at least heard of. When you say Darjeeling tea, it's from a region in India. It's a high mountain region. Very delicate tea, very light, very delicious. In the tea cam, there's a Darjeeling, what we call Darjeeling Himalaya, which is, we have 3 flushes of tea in the tea room. First flush, picked in the early spring. Second flush, picked in the summer. And the third flush, picked in the fall. That pluck is picked in the fall. The most delicate one is the first flush. It has a really light flavor, almost reminiscent of a green tea. So it's kind of like a green black tea. And it's because the tea leaves are really small, super labor intensive. That's why Darjeeling, that is good Darjeeling, is very expensive. So there's first flush in the tea can. And CTC production, again, is fully machine done. Here's a withering trough. It's run through this machine, which crushes, tears, and curls it. That's why they call it CTC. And on the other end of that machine, the tea leaves become fired and dried, and it turns into those little pellets that Ellie showed you earlier. They just look like little brown BBs. The tea, because all the edges of the tea are exposed when you brew it in boiling water, it brews really quickly. So 2 minutes, the stuff is like strong as mud, which is what you want if you're going to add milk to it and sweetener. These machines sorting all the CTC into various grades. So this is a really high-tech machine where the conveyor belts are shaking back and forth, and it's dropping various grades into these bins. And all the tea that Dobra sources is grown organically. So we get high quality grades. The last class of tea we're going to discuss in the 6th class of tea is called pu'er tea. Pu'er is both oxidized and fermented. We've talked a lot about oxidation, think of that cut apple, but we haven't mentioned the word fermentation yet. And when you think of the word fermentation, think of cheeses, wine. Fermentation involves microbes in the absence of oxygen. So maybe should I get a tea? Sorry, I walked away from the camera, but here's a what we call a tea cake. And Ellen's got a nest open there. So they're in various sizes. Some are in these big discs, some are in a nest like she's showing you, some are bricks. But the thing to note is that they're pressed. So in order to make pu'er tea, it's not only oxidized, but it's also fermented. And the fermentation gives it this really dark, earthy flavor. It can be off-putting for some people. It can be kind of almost skunky tasting. But there's two types. There's a green pu'er and there's a dark pu'er. The green pu'ers, or this is actually a white pu'er, which is kind of an exception. But the green pu'ers tend to be a little more astringent and really strong, whereas the darker pu'ers are actually milder. And those are the two types, sheng and shou, raw and ripe. So in the 1970s, the early 1970s, the Chinese figured out how to speed up the pu'er tea production so that it would become ready to drink really quickly, because there was a really large world demand for ready to drink pu'er tea. Because raw tea production, which is the most expensive, takes years to make. Some of these cakes are like 30 or even 40 years old, and they can cost thousands of dollars. We don't source tea like that because no one would buy it, but they do exist. Showing you of a photo inside a tea factory of what we call wet piling, and this is the thing that the Chinese developed in the early 70s to speed up ready to drink pu'er. So what used to take years takes about 2 months in this fermentation room. He's basically standing up to his knees in tea, and he's taking a shovel and he's turning the piles of tea leaves every week, about once a week. And then he's covering that whole area with a thermal blanket. And it's the microbes that are naturally on the tea leaves, as well as the absence of oxygen is what causes that fermentation process. It breaks down the tea leaves and the tea becomes really dark. It's hard to describe if you've never had pu'er. It's like black tea, but much different. It's got like I don't know how to say it. Pungent, almost like your basement. They've done lots of studies on pu'er. Chinese medicine uses pu'er. It's really good for your digestion. The Chinese medicine doctors actually use it medicinally for lots of digestive issues. It's also been proven to burn fat. So we get a lot of people coming into the tea shop just to buy it for that reason. This is how it ends up looking like this, a disc. There's this pressing machine. And sometimes they use a hydraulic machine where the machine will come down with this hydraulic machine. But this was taken in a factory where it's much slower. They don't do that mass production. So they actually stand on that cement block and they rock back and forth until it's in this pressed state. How do you brew this stuff? You just break off a piece, pour boiling water over it, and steep it. And we are going to talk about steeping techniques a little bit too. So here in the tea shop, we do have things other than Camellia sinensis. We have holly teas. So some of you may have heard of yerba mate. That's probably the most known of all the holly teas. There's yerba mate, guayusa, and yopan. Yopan is the only tea, the only plant that's grown in North America that has caffeine naturally. It's native to the southeastern United States. It grows in Texas, Georgia, Florida. It's really delicious if you've never had Yopon. It tastes like a mildly bitter green tea, but it has caffeine, not a lot of caffeine. And I actually, it makes you feel a little bit elated. I really like the way it makes you feel in it. And I love the taste of it. Guayusa, the same thing. Guayusa is related to Yopon, but it's from South America. Same genus, different species. Same with mate. These are all in the same genus, but they're different species. And mate is grown all over South America as well. But Yopon is native to the southeastern United States. We get a bunch of mushroom teas as well. There's a woman in the Cambridge, Massachusetts area who started this company called Tamine Teas. And we source a bunch of mushroom teas from her. And you might be thinking, oh, mushroom teas, that sounds really awful. But they're actually really delicious because she does a great job of mixing them with herbs and spices. So they not only are very good for you, but they also taste really good. Chaga is sort of one of them that's sort of known lately, at least in certain circles. Chaga is grown right here in Maine. You can get it just by going into the forest, getting it off of, it mostly grows on birch trees. But it's really hard. You have to process it up. You have to put it through like a buffalo chopper really, or use an axe, but it's really, really good for you.
I have Rishi Delight.
She's showing you one of the mushroom teas from Tamine Teas called Reishi Delight. So reishi is the mushroom, and then it has other spices in it like rooibos and such. They're some of my favorite teas. We also sell some seaweed teas. There's a company called, what's the company called now? Cup of Sea. He changed his name though. Did? Yeah, Heritage Seaweed. No, oh, it's Cup of Sea, but he also sells other seaweed products from Heritage. So again, seaweed teas, that sounds a little funky, but he also mixes the seaweed with other spices. So they're really good for you. And she's showing you a seaweed tea that we source from him. Emerald honeybush. So it's honeybush, which is an herb mixed with bladderwrack. I think it's bladderwrack, which is a seaweed tea. And then the last one I'm going to talk about is herbal teas. So we kept talking about this earlier, that the fact that everyone calls herbal teas teas, but they're not from Camellia sinensis. Things like spearmint, hibiscus, peppermint, ginger, you name it. We have about 25 different herbal teas. So if you don't want caffeine, we do have that as well. Because all the 6 classes of tea from Camellia sinensis have caffeine in varying degrees. But herbal teas don't, because they're not from that plant. A little bit about loose leaf tea brewing. It's all about tea, time, and temperature, the 3 T's of tea. We get a lot of customers that are saying, I love loose leaf tea. I want to try it, but how the heck do you brew it? I'm used to just taking my tea bag, throwing it in the cup, pouring the boiling water over it, letting it sit for however many minutes. But with loose leaf tea, you can't do that. So we always say that you actually have to use more tea for loose leaf, whole leaf tea than you do for bag tea. And it's because the leaves are larger and they infuse more slowly and not as readily. Because when you break up the tea leaves are going to infuse in that water really quickly. And so whole leaf tea, you actually need to use more tea. So think tablespoon, not teaspoon. Or if you don't have a gram scale, because if the tea industry standard is use 2 to 3 grams per 6 ounces of water. So who the heck knows what a gram is? Well, you'd have to go out and buy a little gram scale, which I would recommend doing if you're going to get into a whole leaf tea, because it's a one-time purchase. They're not very expensive, and you will make so much better tea. If you just stick to that cut it in half, do 2.5 grams per 6 ounces of water, and you won't have to think about it. You do have to think about the water temperature. You don't want to pour boiling water over all your tea. Green tea, white tea, yellow tea, 1 to 2 minutes. Every time we give you a tea from our tea cabinets behind me, we always fill out this form. It has the brewing instructions on it. It's going to tell you what type of tea it is. It's going to tell you how much tea is in it, how many minutes to brew it, what temperature to brew it at. Can I reinfuse the teas more than once? Well, this is the beauty of whole leaf tea. You can take your tea bag and brew it again, but it's not going to taste like a whole lot. Whereas whole leaf tea is actually made for re-steeping. You get some really subtle, interesting flavors on the second, third, fourth, fifth cup. And you can't do that with tea bags. So watch your amount that you use, the time that you brew it, and the temperature at which you brew it. You can see there that it says green, white, and yellow. Use cooler waters. Again, what the heck is 160 degrees? Well, buy yourself a thermometer. Really, if you're going to get into tea, you need a tea scale and you need a thermometer. Your tea will taste so much better. And, the tea producers put their heart and soul into these leaves. And you don't want to, boil the tea because it's just going to ruin it. You're buying high quality tea. You want to treat it as such, and it's going to taste a lot better. But then black teas, oolong teas, pu'er teas, those are less foolproof. You can use hotter water. And the reason is because they're more oxidized, so they can handle those hotter temperatures. They actually need hotter water to bring out the flavor from the leaves. And now we'll leave some time for questions. This is me drinking out of a gaiwan in a park in China. In China, they drink the tea right out of the gaiwan, whereas if you come to the tea room, we actually serve it to you in a cup, just to make it a little easier. Ellen's going to show you a tea cam of a gaiwan. So that's a typical Asian brewing vessel called a gaiwan, which means lidded bowl. It has a bottom and a top. And the lid is not only used to keep the tea hot, but you can use it to stir the tea. You just run it over the tea water and stir the tea, and also to filter the tea when you pour it into a cup. So I'm going to stop this screen share. So I invite you guys to ask any questions.
I just want to ask you, where's your favorite place that you've traveled?
Yeah, so, well, Ellen, you can chime in on that. Favorite place we've traveled.
Taiwan. Well, they're the easiest to travel. India is not difficult. Sri Lanka.
My very first tea trip was to China. I went for 30 days. It was amazing. It was life. I absolutely loved it. You think about China and we hear all these stories that, the cities are nuts and it's crazy. There's so many people, what is it, 1 billion plus? And you go into the Chinese cities and it's just so insane. Beijing and Shanghai, unbelievable how busy those cities are. They're just these megalopolises. But then the country is really big. So you go into the tea producing areas and they're stunningly beautiful. I love China. I love Japan, although Taiwan was incredibly beautiful.
Sri Lanka.
Darjeeling was wonderful. South Korea, incredible.
I just think India is the hardest to travel in. Definitely.
Yeah.
It's a full-on assault on all your senses
Mhm.
and your stomach, because the water, you can't drink the water. And if you eat
Yeah.
something that's been washed in the water,
Mhm.
so India is a little more challenging. Sri Lanka, I really like Sri Lanka because to me it was very similar to India, but without all the craziness of India, and it's much more bearable, I guess.
Yeah, Sri Lanka's like this tropical island that's just really beautiful.
Mhm, yeah. It's just south of India, so it's.
But they're all different. I mean, I love them all, and that's one of the coolest things about this business is where we're able to, travel to these countries every spring, or at least we did until 3 years ago. We mentioned earlier that the Czechs are actually going on a tea trip this spring, but they're going to Turkey by land. They're gonna drive a big bus from Prague to Rize, Turkey, for like 10 days. We're not going to go to that.
So there is one question in the chat. How did you become interested in teas?
Yeah, so about 11, 12 years ago,
Went to Burlington. There's a Dobra in Burlington, Vermont.
yeah.
We were living in the Upper Valley of New Hampshire, Hanover. I was working at Dartmouth, and he was working remotely. He was working in an academic library in Massachusetts, and we were commuting. He was commuting back and forth, so we weren't. And we went to Dobra in Burlington, Vermont. We're like, wow, this is really cool. Let's open one of these in Portland, Maine, because I wanted to move back. So here we are.
Yeah, I mean, because I was
like 2009.
I was an academic librarian in Western Mass, but I was down there during the week. I was renting a room, and then I'd come home on the weekends. I did that for a few years, and that was getting pretty old. So we were like, what can we do to come together, and do this? And I'm a librarian again now, and it's mostly because we needed health insurance after 8 years. We're like, man.
Oh, you like being a librarian too.
And
it suits him better than renting a tea room.
Definitely. So yeah, long journey.
Are there any other questions out there? Feel free to just mute and ask your question if you have any.
I can see there's one by Cynthia Lozier.
Cynthia Lozier.
Are herbicides or pesticides an issue with buying tea? Should one always look for organic labeled? What contaminants does one have to be concerned with when buying tea?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, because a lot of tea producers, especially if they're small farmers, they can't afford the certifications that you would get.
USDA.
The USDA certification. So it doesn't mean that the teas aren't grown organically, but they might not be certified. Like all our teas are either EU certified or they're Wild Arbor. We have like 4 certifications. Can't remember.
Wild Arbor,
EU certified,
meets European organic standards, which is more strict than the USDA organic standards. And then there's Wild Grow.
So
then the
I can't think of the darn things.
Meats.
That's meats EU.
Yeah.
So it is a consideration for sure. But I'll also say this. I mean, just because you buy something that's labeled, organic, it doesn't actually mean that the tea is great, because that, they can get around it. They can, it's not, I'm not saying it's not certified organic. It's just that, it has the label, but was there care gone into growing that tea? Like we know our suppliers. So, I mean, it's kind of a fuzzy answer to your question, but it's a definite something to be concerned about.
One thing I've noticed is that we've been getting more organically grown teas here, and the flavor of non-organic, because when they grow tea, it doesn't mean that they spray it with herbicides or pesticides. They won't spray the leaves, they spray the plant before the leaves even come out. So if they are sprayed at all, it's usually done in the off season. And tea also has a natural ability to repel pests just by its chemical makeup.
Yeah, the tea leaves are pretty bitter. Insects don't.
So they're not. We've never seen like chewed tea leaves, but there is a bug in Taiwan that bites tea leaves, and that actually is called baozhong, and that biting and that biting of the tea leaf brings out some of the sweetness in the leaf. So that's actually a prized tea, believe it or not. So some bugs are good, and then the pesticides. We just have found out that organic teas aren't as flavorful when it comes to Camellia sinensis as non-organic. Just in the 10 years we've been doing it. There's another one about houseplants. Yes, I've tried to grow multiple tea plants. I've got them through there's an online store. I've brought them back from Japan. Our chief supplier gave us one, and
Ellen's a
I'm a
tea
kind
plant,
of a
a tea nut,
tea nut. I collect
tea
seeds
plant
and
nut,
plants.
or plant nut, I meant.
Plant nut, yeah, you can
Yeah.
see the tea room. And I have not had good luck. They are growing them in Asheville, North Carolina. So if you live down there, you might be able to grow. Actually has a little tea field going. It sounds like it's working. It survived the winter. It's the dryness in the winter. I have never been able to keep the balance of the tea plant what it needs going indoors. But they do sell them. You can buy them.
And they're starting to grow tea even in England now because of global climate change. They're actually having some success growing tea, which didn't used to be the case. So tea production is definitely changing worldwide.
Yep, tea can grow stale. I will say that. Green tea and white tea after a year, it starts for green tea, it starts to turn a little brown or yellowing. Fresh green tea is pretty green.
How long is tea fresh, you asked?
Black tea can last longer.
You should put it in an airtight container and away from light, so it should be airtight, away from light. You don't put it in a glass jar where the light can come through it.
Pu'ers are actually good. They age really well. Same with oolongs. So you can age oolongs. You can roast oolongs. We have a little roasting kit we got in Taiwan, and they do that quite a bit. They roast oolongs. This here, pu'er, prize pu'ers of they keep them for 100 years or 30 years or 4 years, and they have a significant monetary value when they are aged.
So that's one of the exceptions of the classes of tea. They actually get better with age. Like green teas that are unoxidized, they're going to age the quickest.
Yeah. So green, white, yellow. I'll say probably want to use those up first. Herbs too. Herbs is kind of their potency. Even though you can still use, I still use basil. That's they get a few years old. God, 5 years old, and it seems to hold its potency. But for some reason, drinking herbs, some of them just lose their.
Yeah, they get dried out. Like any plant. But
that was great. Does anybody have any questions before we wrap things up? I agree with I definitely agree with Holly that this was a great start to our presentation series, our Biddeford Community Garden series, and I think we should have Ray and Ellen back when we can actually taste things.
Yeah. No,
we'll definitely plan on that. But thank you so much for joining us, everyone, and thanks to Ray and Ellen from Dobra Tea. And this will be recorded, so feel free to share it once we get the recording up and going. And thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.
Hey, bye.
Bye now.